Good day, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jack Van Horn from the University of Virginia, and I'm proud to welcome you to this edition of our 2021-2022 Foundations of Biomedical Data Science Seminar Series. This lecture series is supported by UVA's Integrated Translational Health Institute of Virginia, the UVA Brain Institute, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of Data Science, and through a grant from the National Institutes of General Medical Sciences. This year's theme is Ethical Challenges of Artificial Intelligence in Biomedicine, where we enjoy presentations on Friday afternoons from leading thinkers about the promise, opportunities, and hurdles associated with AI applications in the biomedical sciences. Selected participants in our Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab program will leverage these presentations as vital material for our culminating in-person grant project development workshop to be held here in historic Charlottesville, Virginia in June. Today, I am delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. Jan Joly from the McGill University in Montreal, Canada. He is a full professor in the Faculty of Medicine, Department of Human Genetics, and cross-appointed the Bioethics Unit at McGill University, where he is Research Director of the Center for Genomics and Policy. He has been at McGill, so I just learned, since 2009, and he serves as the current chair of the Bioethics Work Group of the International Human Epigenome Consortium and the co-lead of the Regulatory and Ethics Workstream of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. Professor Joly's research interests lie at the interface of the fields of scientific knowledge, health law, and bioethics. In continuing with our theme for this year, in terms of our seminar series, Dr. Joly's lecture will be entitled Addressing Key Challenges in Genomic Health and Data Sharing. The importance of studying large and diverse biomedical data sets is a major advance, is now widely recognized. And big data is central to the concept of learning healthcare systems and applying them to AI in the health field. And following on this, governments, publishers, and other stakeholders are actively encouraging the sharing of data, as we will learn. Professor Joly's presentation today will discuss some of the key challenges to sharing data and highlight recent strategies and tools developed by the international community to address them. As always, we are streaming this lecture live and for recording via YouTube. And if you are watching via YouTube, thank you for joining us. Also, our specially selected 2021-2022 Biomedical Data Science Innovation Lab participants are encouraged to submit any questions they have via the chat feature in their Zoom sessions. I'll synthesize these questions and I will ask them on your behalf during the last 10 minutes or so of the lecture. And with that, Jan, thank you so much. We are super excited to hear from you today.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Professor Van Horn, and thank you for the Foundation of Biomedical Data Sciences and the University of Virginia for the kind invitation to present here today. So I will start with the official disclosure. As was mentioned in the introduction, I am currently the co-lead of the Global Alliance for Genomic and Health Regulatory and Ethics Workstream. And I am the scientific director and CEO of an organization called the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. And both of these organizations will be discussed in the presentation, and some of the tools from these organizations will also be presented. So I think that it's safe to say that our topic for today, genomics and health data sharing, is something that's extremely timely, that is in full spotlight for everybody that is working in genomic research and in other omic sciences. You've all heard about the new upcoming data sharing policy from the NIH. They already, of course, added data sharing policy, but this is basically reinforcing this policy, expanding it and modernizing it, and it's going to impact everyone involved in biomedical research and beyond. So I think it's very important to discuss some of the implication that this policy and other similar policy will have for researchers. And I'm going to take an international perspective to this discussion, but at the same time, the challenges are very similar all over the world in terms of what how this will impact researchers. So with that being said, let me just change to my next slide. I'm struggling a bit with the slide change, but that's it, fixed. Okay, so this is the outline for the talk today. So we'll start by discussing how did we get there? How did we get to this broad data sharing movement in scientific research and in genetics more specifically? Then we'll be discussing about, what is different, if anything, about genetic data that warrants us to discuss it in this specific context, and how can we account for that as we're going to be sharing our data. Then we will really start with going into the art of our topic, and we'll really discuss 4 different domains that have been specifically that have posed specific challenges to data sharing, and we'll also briefly look at what could be some opportunities and solutions to address the challenges raised by these different domains. And I hope after the talk we can have a fruitful conversation, and really the objective is to be as sort of helpful and accessible in the information I'll be conveying. We can get to very granular level in the questions, but I'll be staying at a mostly general level for the presentation to cover the large scope that I am trying to cover. So how did we get there? Well, it's been a long trip. It started really, these discussion about open data sharing started with the Human Genome Project, where really there was this competition to get the full sequence of the human genome as quickly as possible between the public and private, basically, team of researchers in the States. And really, it was in the process of doing this Human Genome Project that we found how important collaboration and data sharing was. And that's the first time some of the key principles on we should share data, what kind of data should be shared, and key consideration on how to share it. This was in 1996. Soon, again, it was felt that this is working well, this data sharing. We need to expand it. And that's where we started thinking about expanding it to different data set, also thinking about different stakeholders in data sharing, because one of the issues, if you want researchers to share their data, is they're not going to do it by themselves. They need help. It's a complicated process to share your data. It can be cumbersome. So it's an ecosystem project, really, data sharing. And other stakeholders, such as research funders, such as publishers, institutions, may have a responsibility in making this data sharing possible and in ensuring this data sharing. So that was sort of what the Fort Lauderdale was pushing towards. And also we have to think beyond just human genetics when we think about data sharing. And that's been a bit of a challenge, because very soon in the process, a different regime was established for non-human genetic material by an international convention on biodiversity, which interestingly enough, the US is one of the countries that is not part of this convention, but a large number of other countries are. So when we talk about international data sharing, that convention is very relevant. And that convention was reinforced by the Nagoya Protocol in 2010 on access and benefit sharing. And really the impact of that protocol has been that it really limited data sharing in wanting to protect the non-human genetic data. developing country, which is, of course, a great idea. The problem is it has really complexified the way that non-human genetic data could be shared. And for that reason, and after a few pandemics warning, in 2011, WHO adopted a pandemic influenza preparedness framework to allow and facilitate genetic data, well, the sharing of biomedical data, including genetic data, in the context of pandemic, and to sort of facilitate it. As I mentioned, it had become quite challenging with Nagoya. So it was really sort of coming back and saying, well, in case of pandemic, here's what needs to take precedence. So all of these documents, by the way, that I am mentioning right now are all available. And I do recommend that people that are interested in data sharing consult them. They're all quite helpful. Next in 2013, an alliance, basically a consortium of over 500 public and private partners, institutional partners, called the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health, was created, really to promote data sharing, to develop the kind of tools that were essential to promote data sharing. And basically, they developed both bioinformatic tools and also ethical tools to make this large-scale data sharing possible. And they work across several work streams that focus on different specificity of data sharing. So that alliance was created in 2013. In 2016, the FAIR guiding principle for scientific data management and stewardship were agreed upon and released in a publication. And these principles are very important because they basically set forward how you should be preparing your data so that it is accessible and usable by researchers, again, across different domains, in order to verify your methodology and to build upon your innovations. Then more recently in 2019, so you see again that interestingly enough, the non-human genetic data sector is a little bit trailing behind the human genetic data. And I say it's interesting because personally, as an ethicist, I could tell you there's less ethical challenge probably in sharing non-human genetic data than in sharing human genetic data. Nevertheless, it's only in 2019 that the Public Health Alliance for Genomic Epidemiology was set forward, and it's basically an international alliance that does similar work to what the Global Alliance does, but in the non-human genetic sector. And finally, of course, I can't not mention COVID-19, which has been a game changer in the field of data sharing. So in January 2020, COVID-19 was declared by WHO to be a public health emergency of international concern. And as most of you know, there's been, first of all, genetics has really come to the spotlight with COVID-19 because we've been extremely interested and had to study the variants of COVID, their different effect, and how they emerge and follow their outbreak, their development and evolution, etc., which was all done through genetics. And thus the importance, again, of not just collecting that information, but sharing it across region, countries, and making it available for the community of researchers around the world. So now let's think a little bit about genetic data and think about what what is so special about genetic data that we should really have special procedure or be careful when sharing this data? Again, from an ethical, legal, social perspective. So first thing that we can say about genetic information is that it is uniquely identifying. It can be used because it's uniquely identifying. We can use that information also to discriminate between individual, and we can use it for profiling purpose. How can we use it to discriminate between individual? Well, genetic information, of course, can be predictive of not only current health. We have genetic diagnostic tests that exist. So genes can be indicative of a disease, but most of the time they can also be predictive of future health. Of course, most diseases have genetic component, as we all know. So that information is, of course, of interest to other parties than just medical researchers, patient. It's also of interest to people like insurers, employers, military organization, etc., because of its predictive nature. And of course, this is an information, genetic information, that we share with not just, it's not just unique to us, but we share it with both our close and distant relatives. So sometimes with whole population group, and of course, all of humanity shares together in a substantial proportion of the human genome. So because of these characteristics of genetic information, what was proposed quite early on, there was this current of thought that is called genetic exceptionalism. And what was really behind this current of thought was really saying, because genetic information has these unique characteristics, it's very sensitive and it should be protected by law. At a higher level, we should have more stringent protection over this type of information than over other types of medical information or personal data. And genetic exceptionalism, we might not hear the word as often today, but it is still quite relevant. And a lot of people have this in mind when they talk about protecting genetic information, about genetic privacy, etc. So it's still very influential. But there are strong arguments, however, that have emerged against genetic exceptionalism. For one thing, it's been shown that, it was not just genetic biomarkers that could be predictive of future health. A lot of non-genetic biomarkers can also predict future health. So for example, we can talk about cholesterol level. We can talk about blood pressure. We can talk about a lot of other types of biomarkers that are also predictive of future health. In fact, I remember a year and a half ago, there was this famous article which presented 14 non-genetic biomarkers. They were mostly chemical biomarkers that were predictive of death in the fairly near future. I think it was over 10 and 20 years. So not something unique to genetic information. And also we've seen the emergence of a lot of new disciplines linked with genetics, such as epigenetic, pharmacogenetic, microbiomics, and all those data share a lot of characteristics with genetic information. They're predictive, they can be unique identifier of an individual. And by unique identifier, I mean really that it takes a little bit of that type of information to really identify an individual uniquely, as in this is, the code that belongs to this particular individual. Of course, it's not the same thing as having the full identifying information on that person, but nevertheless, it's going to be very helpful to re-identify, to find out the identity of a person if you have another database. Of course, there's other types of data even that share characteristics with genetic information. I've given a few examples on the slide: lifestyle, environment, demographic data, etc. So for all of these reasons, it makes one wonder, should we really have a specific focus on genetic and give it that extra amount of protection? Is it really warranted? And furthermore, it's been put forward as well that we should be careful, because the more through our laws, through our media, we make genetic information as being this sort of Pandora's box of information that raise a high level of risk, and that's very stigmatizing. Well, we're creating this sort of negative image of what genetic information is, and we're participating in stigmatizing it more than we should really be. So we have to be careful that in overprotecting it, we might actually make it more vulnerable. So these were sort of the arguments that have been put forward against genetic exceptionalism. And still today, this sort of debate of should genetic information be protected more than other health data or not, it's still ongoing to this day, and it has a big impact on public policy. So let's check our first sort of area that we will be discussing. So it's the area of data privacy. So of course, the first hurdle that you will often hear when it comes to time to share data is that, well, there are legal and ethical requirements, and institutional administrative requirements that basically makes it very complicated or prevent me as a researcher to share the data. So the first level, privacy is the first level in a way of hurdle that is often raised against data sharing. And of course, privacy is important because privacy is requisite of trust. If you cannot trust the system as a patient or as a research participant, you're not going to provide your information. So it does make sense to guarantee to people that we'll be able to reasonably protect their information. And that's what privacy is all about. Privacy, of course, applies to personal data, which means that it needs to belong to a person. If I find a blood spot on the street, it's not personal data, because what it is biological information, but I can't associate it to a person's identity without going through an unreasonable amount of challenge, both from a technical level, legal level, etc. So because this blood spot is sufficiently de-identified, it's not associated with a specific individual, it's not personal data, according to, and then it's not protected by privacy law. Similarly, properly de-hosted, and that's very important and was very important in the context of COVID, properly de-hosted virus genome sequence does not constitute personal data. What do I mean there by properly de-hosted? Well, sometimes when you sequence the COVID virus that you've collected from a human patient, there is a bit of human genetic data left mixed, tangled with the viral genome sequence. So you have to de-host it. But once that is done, you're talking about the viral sequence, you're talking about the genome sequence of a virus. So it's not human data, it's not personal data, it's not identifying. Therefore, it can be shared quite easily because it doesn't fall under the scope of privacy law. Last point I want to make about privacy, most of the researchers that work internationally are aware of the General Data Protection Regulation. I have a feeling you'll probably hear more about it in the context of other seminars of this series. It's just incontrovertible. You cannot go around the General Data Protection Regulation. It's a European regulation that carries extraterritorial weight and that it applies beyond the European border, and it's made to protect the data privacy. It's, however, a very contemporary approach at protecting information. It imposes a lot of new responsibility over researchers. And so if you're going to be sharing your data internationally, especially if you're going to be taking in European data, you absolutely must know about the requirement of the GDPR and be able to meet those requirements. Otherwise, you will not be able to share data with European colleagues. How do we protect privacy? Very quickly, there are several ways. So again, it's not something that is unfeasible. There are several approaches to protecting your data. These are just a few key approaches to do that. You can de-identify your data. So basically, you remove some of the metadata that is associated with your genomic data, and up to a point where it's becomes extremely complicated to re-identify it. Basically, you have this genetic sequence, but you cannot link that genetic sequence with an individual's identity, the identity of a specific individual without unreasonable effort. So you de-identified your genetic material by removing, for example, the name of the person it belongs to, where they live, their social insurance number, etc. Of course, there are laws in the US like EPA, I know, has some specific requirement for de-identification. I'm not going to go there today, but they are a good starting place to see what's needed to de-identify information. IT security tools are all the information technology programs, software tools that you can use to protect your data. They go from very simple things, but that everybody sort of know are needed, such as firewall. Normally all good university have firewalls to protect the data of the university, coding, encryption, which has become increasingly sophisticated, password access, etc. Beyond that, there are administrative measures you can take and are taken to protect data. When you're dealing with sensitive data, you use a tiered access system where basically people have to agree to some specific contractual terms if they want to see your data. So that's what we call the tiered access system. That's where you have those repository like dbGaP that have access committee that have specific requirement to give you access to the data. Nowadays also, we hear a lot about data federation. What's data federation? Sometimes specific database are not willing to share the data. They want to keep the data in the database. And then what you can do is sometimes have a specific link between different database, and you can ask your query through a single portal and obtain the information from that access portal without viewing what's in the database. You only view the answer to your question in a non-identifiable format. So you're basically protecting each local database, but making it possible to query them and to obtain a single answer from these various databases. And of course, we're at the day and age where everybody should know that you can't protect privacy completely. You can only do your best. You can only do a reasonable effort. And that must be made clear to patient, research participant, etc. What basically you want to do is be transparent and say, here's what I can do and here's what I'm doing to protect your data. Of course, explain it in terms that the lay public can understand. And also, it's nowadays one concept that has become extremely important is that of imputability. Somebody has to take responsibility for protecting the information. We need to know who these people are. Very often now, you are required as an institution, for example, if you're going to share data according to the GDPR that I mentioned, you need to have a data privacy officer, a person that's responsible for privacy at your institution. And that's part of this idea of imputability. Now, why is it important to protect genetic information? Well, for many reasons. I mean, it is personal information, of course, and everybody know what privacy breach can be conducive to. But the problem that's been particular to genetic, and that has been discussed a lot in the media, especially in the United States, is the issue of genetic discrimination. It's a question I've studied for many years. And one thing that's interesting about genetic discrimination is that the actual incidence of genetic discrimination is fairly limited in terms of, what we can do with genetic information right now, especially looking at the predictivity of genetic information, is limited to a lot of monogenic, highly penetrant disorder. Of course, we're now starting to move beyond that. We're even talking about polygenic risk score, but if you want to be able to predict with almost certainty the development of a disease in a way that this information could be available and could be of interest to insurers, employer, etc., you're limited in the number of disease, etc. That's why the incidence of genetic discrimination has not been extremely widespread. It's not been seen all over the different use of genetic that we make in the research and medical context. But nevertheless, especially in the US, it's been a problem. And people are quite concerned about genetic discrimination. They need to be reassured. They need to know that their genetic information is protected. And one word maybe about the map that you can see on this slide is just to give you a sense of the studies that have been done on genetic discrimination on the topic of life insurance. And what it shows you is that we know very little still about the phenomenon of genetic discrimination. And in order to address it and to develop laws that will be efficient against genetic discrimination, there's a need to study it in much more details, because our laws are not that effective yet at countering these problems. And we also have to think nowadays about stigmatization and discrimination at the level of population. This is going to become one key issue in genetic, because we want to have a data set that are more diverse. We want to represent minority group of the population in our studies so that they can benefit from research. But in doing that, the effect is that there might be some use of this information to stigmatize or discriminate these populations. So we have to be very careful as we're proceeding in this good direction of including more minority group in the research. And for those interested in this, please contact me at the Genetic Discrimination Observatory. What we do is really attempt to tackle this genetic discrimination issue the way that I believe it should be done, which is at the international level. Because genetic information is now shared across national border, we cannot have this local view of genetic discrimination. Mind you, it's important to be active at the local and national level, but we also need to have this larger perspective on it of how can we adopt, again, rules that are coherent at the international level to prevent genetic discrimination. I spoke about the importance of diversity. It's another of these big questions now in data sharing. So how can we make sure that we're not sharing only data on white people of European ancestry? How can we be more inclusive in the data types that we take on and use? So we first of all have to understand why some of these minority groups are reluctant to participate. And one of the first reasons is what we call intersectionality, which is very often it's the same group that are already victimized based on racial discrimination, based on poverty, on access to healthcare, etc., that are the most at risk of, again, being victimized by, let's say, genetic discrimination. It always falls on the same group, which is why they're sort of reluctant when you talk to them about participating in genetic research. So one of the first thing that should be realized is this problem of intersectionality, and how can we address it to make these populations that have been victimized and more marginalized by society, how can we make them confident that with genetic research, this is going to be different and lead to benefit for them? Considering them and including them in our data set, as I said, it's an ethical and medical imperative. Any scientist will tell you in genetics that if you only use data from white European population, well, you're only going to get robust genetic result for those population. And so your result will only have limited application and will not benefit a large population group within even a single country. So how do you do this? How can you make sure you have these groups? You have to start early if you want to include these minority population group. You have to engage them early to know what their expectations are. Are there specific terms of engagement for them to participate that are important for them? You need to build the trust that has been eroded over the years of abuse. So the earlier you can start engaging them in the process, the better it is. And collecting data is not sufficient. We have sometimes database that actually took it upon themselves to collect this data, but because the data is still in smaller quantity than the data of European population, the data basically lay dormant in database and is not used by researchers. There's a duty for scientific researcher to use this data. It's really important. And so they should almost justify not using it if they're not going to use all the data from the different population data that are in a database. So again, some tips to increase the participation of minority population. Think about whether specific consent modalities would be useful. Think about maybe how to address the concern that there might be data misuse or genetic discrimination. Is a law needed or some sort of regulation to give them more protection, etc. Also, self-governance is becoming extremely important for those communities. So they want to have some say in what is done in the data. They want to be involved. They want to benefit from the research. Capacity building is important. Equitable access to drugs that may be developed from the research might be a consideration. And finally, you need to, from the get-go, build this relationship and start this engagement. But also as regulator, I think it's critically important that strong metrics are developed to then be able to assess how researchers have performed on this particular task of including more diverse population in their data set and use this data in their research. So metrics are key. I've put one article that's proposing interesting metrics, an interesting metrics approach in the context of COVID-19. So you may want to have a look at that particular article. Another key area, if you're thinking of sharing data, is the area of attribution and reward. It's often, sometimes we don't think about it. We sort of assume that the people who produce the data, that create the database, that they will share their data. They will not automatically share their data. I used to have a slide. Those of you that are familiar with the Lord of the Ring know the creature Gollum. And I often would compare a researcher's relationship to their data with that of Gollum and the ring, in that it is their treasure. The data is the treasure of the researcher. So how do you get them to share this treasure? Well, you get them to do that by giving them something that they would like to have. And these are some suggestions of what should be given to researcher. Of course, co-authorship might be warranted in some cases. Sometimes it might just be more of an acknowledgement. There might be collaboration requirements. The problem right now with that is that those rules vary by discipline, by country. They're not as well aligned at the international level. And for example, between the human genetics and the public health genetics branch, they're very different. And so when you want these branches to collaborate, it's going to make things more complicated because they're going to have different expectations. Additional funding. Of course, funders need to contribute to data sharing. It's not going to happen without a cost. And so somebody has to help researchers with the cost of data sharing. There's been other mechanisms sometimes to encourage researcher that I like a bit less. Embargo is an example where basically we're going to say to a researcher, it's almost like a patent where you say to a researcher, well, you can share your data and we'll embargo it, meaning nobody's going to use it. People are going to be able to view it, but it's going to take a couple of years before they can actually do something with it so that you have a head start. It becomes problematic, especially if the embargo is for a substantially long period of time. Another one that I'm not a fan on is intellectual property right. I think they need, especially if you're upstream in the research process and genetic, I would not recommend the use of IP right. I think that, you want to make it clear actually that you shouldn't be patenting anything like raw genomic data. First of all, in most patent systems across the world, patenting raw genomic data is not something that's possible, but it's also really not conducive to good collaborative science. So beyond all of these elements that I've just mentioned now, there are a lot of administrative burden that make data sharing complicated. And so this is, for example, it's almost like a checklist. If a researcher's, because very often I have colleagues at the university that are starting, and it's sort of the first time that they are into a big genetic project, and they come to me and they say, well, what do I need to do to share my data? What do I need to think of? So these are all the administrative steps that will likely have to happen for you to be able to share your data. You're going to have a consent form where you're going to recruit research participant that's going to be fairly broad, meaning that it's going to allow you to do many things with the data. It's not going to be permitting research on a really specific disease. No, it's going to be, I want to use the data I'm collecting from you in all kinds of medical research. It's going to permit to you to share your data internationally. All these things have to be included in the consent. So you need to really tailor your informed consent very carefully as you start recruiting participants. Then also before you get started, you're going to need a governance model, a governance framework for your database, and a data access model, as in what are the requirements that people are going to have to meet in order to access my data. Finally, you're going to also have to think about what are the specific privacy requirement and setting that my database will have. So is the data that is going to be stored in my database, is it going to be coded genetic data? So basically, I don't have any direct identifiers such as a name or a social insurance number, but I may have indirect identifier, and there is a code that links my genetic information with the name. And somebody is able to, let's say, link the genetic information with the medical file of the participant. So we're talking coded data here. That can be how you're going to work in your database. Or it could be anonymized data where you decide that you're not going to no longer need the personal information. And so you strip it permanently. You're talking more about anonymized data and about de-identified data set if you do that. So these are some of the privacy setting and all of the other things that we talked about when we covered the question of privacy. Then we're going to have to think about ethics approval. Or is the data that's in my database, first of all, am I needing an ethics approval to collect it from participant? Do I need to have their consent, as we've mentioned? Do I need ethics approval? But also, furthermore, will researchers that want to have access to my database need to have an ethics approval in order to access my data? So you have to think about this in both directions if you're providing data access. You also have to set up your data access committee if you're going to be giving access to sensitive data, and prepare data access agreement. Of course, there's a way to circumvent some of these burdens. So you may want to use dbGaP as a repository for your data. In that case, they have their own data access committee. Of course, you will still stipulate the access conditions or what's in the access agreement to some extent, but they will provide the infrastructure, the committee, etc. So some of these steps can be circumvented. And finally, of course, there's the whole technical steps that is required to prepare the data for the user and the download time. So all of these things that also need to be considered. So in concluding my presentation, before we open it to question, I would say that these are some steps that I would say are part of a path forward that will make life easier for people that want to share data. So early preparedness is key. Nowadays, if you're going to do large-scale genetic research, don't think you're going to do much in the first years, because you're not. Anybody that's been in the business will tell you you're going to take about a year or more, 2 years sometime, to just engage the population group that you want to recruit and to develop your governance framework for your data. So this is part of the cost of sharing data that you have to keep in mind. Early engagement with vulnerable population, and also you need to really think again from a really perspective way of, okay, what are the risks that my data incur from the start? What's the risk? What could be some of the possible worst events? How can I prevent them? And how can I convey to my participant the level of privacy that I'll be able to provide to the data? Then I think that a really important step, and that's for the entire research community, is to limit the number of data repository. There is sometimes this feeling of, again, it's my data, therefore I want my own repository because I want to be in control. There's that desire to, even though and you have no choice but to share your data, to want to retain control of the data, therefore to think, well, I'll have my own repository, this way I can really control things. It's really not a good idea unless you have a strong reason to do that other than just controlling the data. Otherwise, I would say simply use, a larger repository, make sure that the condition that of access respond to your particular need, but please don't multiply repository. It just makes data access more complicated and more procedural across the board for everybody. And try to keep the administrative step to access data to the strict minimum. You don't always need a complex data access agreement followed by a material transfer agreement, followed by piecemeal negotiation process. You can very often, have this done in a very limited amount of steps via a very simple agreement. And this is what people should strive to do. And finally, as I said, this is an ecosystem where not just the researcher have responsibilities, but all the different parts of the ecosystem need to be involved, and funding agency especially need to provide the financial cost that is required to share data for researchers. And I want to also, and I think this is going to be really important for researchers working in this field, these are some of the key good practices that I would really direct you to that could be extremely useful if you want to develop a repository and have a governance framework that's going to be strong from a fair data access and international data access perspective. Here are some of the key documents and guidelines that really you would need to follow and to take into account. And I'll be happy to speak more specifically to some of these if there are questions. And I want to thank you very much for listening. Be happy to answer a question. As you can see that my dogs and cats were there doing the oversight while I was preparing my presentation. So I want to acknowledge their help as well. And of course, all the funders. Thank you very much. And we can open it to questions.
Thank you so much, Jan. I really appreciate your comments. My first question is, do you have to offer your dogs and your cats co-authorships on anything that you produce?
I think that, again, you need to think about enticement and how I can get them to cooperate. And I think food's more appropriate for them.
Very food motivated. You brought up, in all seriousness, you got up several different elements. And I liked how you really kind of touched on the tension that exists between openness of data and security and the research potential that data has. And that kind of that triad of push-pull relationships that exist on that. I'm very curious to get your sense of, like, what is it that keeps people from really wanting to share their data? Sometimes people hide behind security and say, oh, I couldn't do it, and my IRB will never let me do it. But on the other hand, that sort of can be kind of perceived sometimes as a cop-out. Are there other reasons why people might not want to share their data or hide behind, sort of, I don't know, not necessarily the best reasons to share their data?
Right. So today we've addressed the real hurdles. Of course, there are very often other reasons, and with COVID, some of these reasons have become quite apparent. So I will only name two, for example. I think a lot of time when you talk about data sharing with commercial enterprise, with pharmaceutical company or biotech, small biotech startup, well, they're worried about sharing their data because for them it's an asset, and they have to make a profit. It's not like a publicly funded researcher, right, where you can have the argument of, well, you're funded by the public and your research should directly benefit the public. So in those cases, very often, but to be fair, even some publicly funded researchers will want to keep their data secret to have a commercial advantage, or what they perceive to be a commercial advantage, because they're afraid that if they don't share, they'll be scooped. Another interesting phenomenon that we've seen during COVID is really public health, sometimes being public health agencies not always being willing to share their data with the research community. And interestingly, one of the key reasons why they don't like to do that was a fear that their data was going to be misrepresented by researcher, that it could be used to show that they had done mistake in their own work, or to give an image that would be, for example, more alarmist than what the situation was really in a given state or province. And so they sort of felt that it was sort of within their mandate sometimes to prevent that sharing in order to protect these, I would say, personal interests. And when I say that, I'm mostly building from my experience in Canada, where I was quite involved in data sharing for research. But I don't know, you can tell me if that also resonates with what happened in the US.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Lots of people have a lot of reasons. They'll say, well, I don't have the staff to do that. I don't have the funds to support it.
Right.
But even just in my own experience, I've experienced where people will say, well, my experiment is too complicated for me to explain it to you, so I'm not going to share my data. And if you point out to people that perhaps that doesn't meet the definition of science, then they don't tend to like that so much. But on the other hand, there are these sort of enticements, as you referred to earlier, things like co-authorships or certainly acknowledgements or collaborations on grants or some funding related activities. At what point do some of these relationships become sort of a quid pro quo kind of cost of doing business? I want to use this data, and now I have to give these people an acknowledgement or a co-authorship, which I hadn't intended to do, but now I have to do it. Some people see that as a negative, and so it actually means that they don't use certain repositories that they might otherwise want to take advantage of. Do you find that as well?
Yes, I mean, it happens. I think the key here is, as you say, it's a quid pro quo. So you really need to, both parties need to find an advantage there. And so one of the problem right now, as I mentioned, is those rules are not harmonized. And in some field, those rules are extremely restrictive, such as you cannot use my data if you don't, if I don't agree with what you're proposing to do. I want to see a plan. I want you to then share your result with me so that I can use your result myself. So plenty of conditions that can make it quite complicated. You're not going to patent your result ever, things like that. So I think that the key here is really working hard on this harmonization of acknowledgement and attribution rules. And first of all, start within broad sectors, and then really even across sectors, because I would say that very often there's no real strong justification. Why would, for example, in one sector, somebody that produces data would need to be a co-author on a publication in order to share his or her data, while in another sector, simply give them a thank you or acknowledging the repository through a citation format is sufficient. We should be agreeing on whether we're okay with citation and acknowledgement, which I think is enough in most cases, or whether sometimes co-authorship is really warranted. And I would say that only where there's a real collaboration and a substantial role of the data producer in the final paper, would this co-authorship really be warranted?
So with regard to collaboration, what can early career researchers do to get involved with efforts like your own to help improve the data sharing policy and practice?
Well, I think for the next few years, just documenting the experience of those early researchers is going to be key, because one of the strongest arguments against data sharing is that it has a really important adverse impact on early career researchers and on people who have smaller genetic projects, because mainly they risk being scooped, and also the cost is just too heavy for them to bear. So I think it's really important for them to speak out, make sure that the challenges they meet in data sharing is well reflected and is heard by research funders, so that we can adapt the rules of data sharing for them to be fair to those new players and those important players. If we want it to happen across the board, we really have to have a system that's going to have that built-in flexibility, where again, data sharing is going to be attractive by everyone, for everyone in the ecosystem. And right now, I don't think it is as attractive as it should be for newer researchers and small scale researcher who have to learn all those rules and think about all those processes that they need to do if they ever want to get into big data and AI.
Jan, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us, and very thought-provoking about how we can improve upon data sharing, how we can do just better, what that means for our science, respectively, and what it means internationally. That is just so absolutely vital. I was really felt that was a really strong statement. We have to do this internationally because different countries have different rules. We need to communicate with each other. Science doesn't know, political boundaries or geographic boundaries. We really need to improve things across the planet if we're going to be successful scientifically, moving into deeper into the 21st century and beyond. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us. This has been really helpful. And I want to thank you again. Thanks everybody who joined us, and everyone have a